computer. Okie dokie. So we're now recording. And without further ado, unless anybody thinks I'm missing anything from Jill or Josh or...
I would just add, Josh, actually, it was your thought. There will be a chance to ask questions. So just letting everybody know, if you have questions, and Kim, you can decide if you want people to interrupt or wait, but there will be a chance for engagement and questions.
Okay. One thing I will, and I don't know that I'm necessarily assigned as host, but if you all have the function for closed captions, that would be nice to engage if we have it. That way that can also be accessible to folks to the transcript. And if not, if folks have questions or it'd be helpful for me to repeat things, please let me know. I am really happy to be with you all this morning or afternoon. I guess it's gotten that way. I'm in Texas. And so we will spend a considerable amount of time together. I think for the sake of time, we might pause questions for the end, and then I'm happy to go back to different parts of the presentation, and you all will have access to the presentation here in just a second. I'm gonna, the title page has a QR code where you can get the presentation pulled up, and that way you have access to it. So no pressure around, you know, if you want to take notes just to kind of reflect back questions, that might be helpful, but you'll also have access to this. And then I also put a link at the end to the full report. So if you really want to kind of go in, then you can do that. And in the presentation itself, I put in a lot more data than I'm going to actually go over, just in case folks want to just use that solely. It would have the bulk of the data. Liz, I'm noticing your facial expressions. Do you have a question or need something?
I did make you co-host. I'm looking for the closed captioning thingamajig. How do I find it?
It may not be, let me see, it may not be a feature because typically it's just down at the bottom as an option.
Well, it's strange that it wouldn't be available. Okay, I don't know. That's a bummer.
Liz, are you in using the MAGPS?
Mm-hmm.
Huh. I would think you should be able to assign a...
It might be that if you haven't updated Zoom in a while, that might have a piece of that, but I don't know if that.
I don't know how to do it.
It's usually on the bottom if it's available.
And you don't see it either, Kim. I'm not crazy, right? No. Okay. I don't know what to do. I'm sorry about that, everyone. I will work on it in the background, but go ahead, Kim.
Okay, yeah, if you can keep working on it, that would be helpful. Typically, it's just there at the bottom as one of the options for hosts. I think I do a pretty good job around enunciation. And so hopefully folks will be able to see here. So I'm going to share my screen, and please continue to welcome yourselves and kind of come into the space. Please take care of yourselves as you need to. I'm not actually going to have a ton of folks on the screen on my end, but I do not get distracted by people just moving and being how they need to be in this space. So no pressure there. And again, recognizing that folks may come in and out of being on screen, that's also perfectly fine as well. Taking the information in whatever way is best for you all. Okay, so presentation and that QR code will give you access to this PowerPoint, and I can share that out a little later. I actually can put a link in the chat. Let me do that.
Great.
Let me- I'll just grab the link to the report while I'm at it. Okay, is everyone, is the screen accessible to everyone, my screen?
So far.
Yes. Mhm.
All righty, well, we are here to share out results of the assessment. And just for context for folks, it's been a little bit. It's been almost maybe 9-10 months, and it's been a process. We extended deadlines and that sort of thing. So we are looking at assessments results that are from I guess you could say technically last summer would have been the last opportunity. So keep that in mind, as I recognize that we have, there's been a lot of life lived in the last 6 months. And so particularly as we're thinking about racial equity needs, certainly there may be some more that have developed in the last few months. So get my screen on. So I wanted to just start, Liz, you already did this, but it feels really important to me that I acknowledge the Anti-Racism Committee in terms of how they've helped support this process, in terms of the administration of the assessment and ways that we talked through increasing participation. So it's been really invaluable. And then also to Sonia, I don't think that she was on today, but Sonia Khan found a platform for us to utilize and made the getting results pretty streamlined. So shout out to Sonia as well. And I also want to start, I've alluded to this, but I want to acknowledge, although I really do believe that words fail me and probably anyone in trying to convey the depth of just compassion and grief and rage and horror. There's just so much violence, displacement, uncertainty that we're navigating on a global level. And certainly we have been navigating this, and I think the advances in technology have really increased our access to and exposure to the traumas of the world. And I'm sure that we will be studying the impacts of pandemic and all of what's happening even locally. Fortunately, you all are not living in Texas, USA, but I am. So legislation and the impact that it has on all of us and on this work in particular, especially for those of us who are deeply committed to equity in mental health. And so just want to name and recognize that we are navigating a lot. And because of that, and just because of the nature of our lives and how complex we are, there isn't going to be one single assessment or survey or listening session that's going to do justice to reflect the racialized experience of the MAGPS membership and community. So I hope that this presentation and the information that you all shared and we were able to kind of organize and synthesize does help to inspire, right? Inspire folks to move forward, and certainly would be in solidarity with all forms of resistance and restoration and reconciliation that we can have. Okay, so reminders about what the intention was. From the needs assessment process, we wanted to have a point of reference for ARC and the board around racial equity initiatives. We wanted to gather data that would support any updates to bylaws and just policy and procedure around how you all come together and how you organize how the organization is structured. And then hopefully this also will be helpful in formalizing a plan, right, moving forward. And I'll talk a little bit about specific topics and suggestions. And one of them that came from the assessment was to have like concrete goals, you know, moving forward. And so, and then now hopefully have a process and a method for ongoing assessment. So that's what we hope to do. And I am going to kind of dive in. And so we had, and I didn't put these stats in, but we had quite a few people with all of the distribution that happened on the listserv. We had quite a few folks to at least open the email and maybe even start and kind of take a look at the survey. So it was open 400 times. But what you will see here is representative of about 80 participants. And what I know of conference attendance and that sort of thing, I think that that's a pretty good response rate. Now, we can't assume that those are the same 80 folks that usually attend the conference, but you know, in terms of the amount of information and the amount of people who participated, it looks like a pretty good chunk of folks. So I am going to start us off by going through highlights from each of the sections. And so this is going to be simply data. It does not include much kind of interpretation or any suggestions. So I'm going to go through that. And as I go through these highlights, I want to invite you to maybe take notes or think about what meaning you can make of this, because one of the things that I know is that I'm not a part of the organization. And so I am looking at this with a different lens. I certainly have spent time with the board over the last 2.5 years or so, but you all have probably more context and some really valuable context. So as I go through this first portion, I intentionally set it out to be just kind of, here's the information and here's the facts. And then I'll kind of go in more depth in each of these sections to kind of share thoughts. And then we'll close out with recommendations, of course. So about almost all of the folks who completed this survey and participated in this needs assessment are licensed. And so that's something to take into consideration. So we'll talk a little bit more about what that means, but about half psychologists, and then a third social work, and then about 10% LPC. And a good majority of the folks who participated would consider themselves kind of long-timers in the organization. But about 20% who completed this, 1 in 5, have only been affiliated for okay? So a good chunk of folks are newer members. A large majority identify as women, and then a large majority identify as white, and about 20% within LGBTQIA plus community. Nearly half identify as spiritual, and you'll see about a third Jewish, another close to third, or about 25% Christian, and then the 13% Buddhist. And almost 1 in 4 indicated having some sort of disability, and we certainly did not ask specifics about that, but something that was notable. We also asked in this section a little bit about folks' attendance and reasons why they might attend conferences, meetings, that sort of thing, and then also reasons why they haven't. And so the top reasons for attending were clinical relevance, and you'll see that's also one of the top reasons for not attending. But clinical relevance is really important in terms of how folks are making decisions about attendance. Continuing education opportunity also makes sense if we think back to, you know, a good majority of these folks anyways are licensed, and so having access to continuing education also was a top reason. And then being able to reunite with colleagues, so being able to connect and be in community with other folks is a big part of why folks are attending. And then some other things were certainly of note, like location, cost, feeling represented in kind of some of the topics. And so, and then for not attending, again, clinical relevance, accessibility, and then also cost. And again, I put in specifics so you can go through if you want to kind of look at some of the other, I just put in highlights, but certainly we have more information in terms of demographics and affiliation with the organization there that folks can take a look at. Okay, so section 2 took a closer look at conferences, meetings, and communication needs. So looking specifically at, you know, kind of when you all come together and kind of getting a sense of the needs. So one thing that, you know, stood out is that in terms of the survey, at least half of the folks who participated indicated having attended at least one event per year. And so some relatively good participation in that sense. And about 77, or about 75% of folks noted that they are at least reading, you know, emails that come through the listserv monthly, right? So pretty active and engaged there. And of note specific to racial equity, that equity-related programming is for two out of 3 people is a big part of why they choose to affiliate with the organization. And 70% of folks find value in learning from folks who have similar identity as themselves. And again, I'll kind of move through this a little a little bit so folks can kind of take a look at some of the more specific parts. My feet was caught on my rug, moving around a little bit. And again, I'll give more context to some of these, but want you all to have an opportunity. Okay. And I just realized I'm not looking at the chat. I just want to check in to see if anyone has any needs that I haven't noticed yet. Liz, Jill, y'all are on my screen. I can see y'all. Anything come through? Okay. All right. So section 3, we looked at people's thoughts about the direction of DEI initiatives within the organization. And so there is, and we'll talk a little bit about this because the ARC and board have a lot of questions about, well, you know, how do we look at, people's interests versus attendance. So we'll spend quite a bit of time here, but there was quite a bit of variability around whether or not the organizations, whether or not the membership of Mid-Atlantic is reflective of the clinical populations that folks serve. And I don't think that that's necessarily, unique to Mid-Atlantic, but something that stood out to me. And particularly in this section, some highlights for me is that a majority of folks who participated in this, 92%, find meaning professionally related or connected to the equity related programming. And so 80% would describe the organization as anti-racist, and 87% anticipate meaningful shifts within the organization connected to racial justice. And close to 2/3 noted interest in community engagement, so more engagement that is connected to anti-racism. Okay, section 4 highlights from organizational structure and bylaws. In this section, compared to other sections of the survey, there was a relatively low response rate. So in this section in particular, there was much more kind of not applicable responses, and that varied on each item from anywhere from 10% to 30%. So that, is something to hold in mind as I go through what these percentages might mean. It wasn't necessarily reflective of everyone who participated in the survey, but of those who were able to respond and give feedback related to bylaws and structure, 82% indicated that They believe that the expertise that the leadership team has is sufficient regarding anti-racism, and that there's a belief, a very strong belief, that Mid-Atlantic elevates the expertise specifically of your BIPOC membership. And there is specifically also folks agree that there's effort that's made to reduce emotional labor of BIPOC members. And so, again, these all stood out to me. I think it's notable that there is about 44% of folks that believe that membership is adequately involved in anti-racism initiatives, which to me means a majority of folks might believe that there's not adequate involvement, or in this case, 34% were kind of neutral on the issue. So this also seemed notable to me, that kind of looking at the involvement in initiatives and kind of increasing involvement might be helpful. All right, and I'll just move through some of these. Okay. And kind of looking more specifically at membership involvement, and included kind of broad involvement, and then also specific to the initiatives, quite a bit of information here that was notable. 84% indicated that Mid-Atlantic is high quality, and that is, kind of relative to their participation in other organizations. And so quality, this is a quality organization for the folks who participated in this. And there is an overwhelming belief that Mid-Atlantic fosters inclusion and belonging, and that 91% of folks understand the need for accountability regarding race equity. And then it's specific to whether or not white supremacy culture should be talked about within Mid-Atlantic. Notably, there was no disagreement. So everyone agrees that should be talked about, and that also feels notable. And then on these last two notes, there was a little bit of kind of that note around response rate. So although 10% of the folks who responded to who participated didn't respond to this, of those who did, 81% of folks agree that racial injustice is named and addressed within the organization. But it's notable that on this response, there were 10% of folks who didn't respond to this item. And again, I don't have a way of knowing why that was, but it is notable. And then again, over a fourth, close to a third, no response, or either neutral, disagree. But for the people who did, there is a consensus that self-disclosure and around experiences of racism is worthwhile. And again, I'll move through some of the data so that you all can see that. and I'll just make a note here that you'll see that there was more variability around whether or not it felt worthwhile to disclose connected to marginalization. So this would be experiences of microaggression, that sort of thing. That was more varied, but still, you know, as you can see, I'll do some quick math. 71% of folks, you know, believe that it's worthwhile. And then, of course, it's notable that a good majority, and there's less variability there, do find value in disclosing around privilege, right? So naming privilege, naming the, you know, that, and naming also kind of harm that's connected to privilege. Okay. The last section before we kind of get into narrative responses was looking at just kind of assessment of where folks are, both yourself and other folks, in terms of your own sense of race equity. And so 38% of participants noted having racial identity affirmed as being important for participation in programming. 36% noted it as unimportant, and 26% were neutral. And I'll invite you to think back to some of the demographics, particularly connected to race. And so recall that a good majority of participants, about 70%, identified as white. And so this is a really interesting and kind of something for us all to maybe think about and wonder about what it would mean to have, you know, 36% of folks white, in this case, if a large majority are identified as white, what it would mean to have that identity affirmed. And even in the question, there might be some, you know, some uncertainty about how to respond to it altogether, but there was quite a bit of variability there. Again, no one disagreed. Everyone, you know, agreed that there is professional benefit in learning about anti-racism, and close to 80% strongly agreed. And then again, similarly, 93%, and I believe also on this one, there was no disagreement as well, but 93% of people indicated strong agreement that being uncomfortable is important when we're thinking about racial privilege. And when folks are comparing themselves to their colleagues, most, about 70%, are feeling confident in their abilities around addressing anti-racism. But there was a good chunk in terms of these participants, about 13%, who feel that they lack confidence relative to colleagues. And then almost 90% noted feeling like they've improved their group facilitation skills, group leadership skills, because of racial equity and justice programming. And then it also felt notable to me that there was quite a bit of variability around whether participation in Mid-Atlantic sponsored programming is reflective of their general interest in programming. And so I'll talk a little bit more about what that would mean, but from my perspective, but it felt notable. Okay. As you can imagine, narrative feedback is going to have a little bit more information, and there certainly were a few more highlights. And so I'm going to kind of touch on a few of these, and then we'll circle back because I want to, kind of get more to recommendations, that sort of thing. So just in terms of the narrative feedback, it seems that most folks believe that there is an intention of alignment with Mid-Atlantic stated anti-racism values. So that is, kind of notable. And when folks talked about that alignment being there, some of the things that they linked that to was conference topics, the affinity group, organizational policy, leadership, representation in leadership, those sorts of things. And they again kind of noted that Mid-Atlantic versus, or in comparison to other groups that they're affiliated with, is really doing that work, or that it's maybe a little bit more obvious. And when it came to whether or not, Mid-Atlantic is operating, ways that Mid-Atlantic is operating outside of its stated values, that's certainly varied. But there were examples of not having term limits, maybe on, and again, you all would have more context for what folks might have been referencing, but that would be outside of, of the stated value, maybe limited outreach efforts, thinking a little bit about access and ableism, and then the lack of explicitly naming harm. Those were examples that were given. And then, of course, it was also notable that some folks named that they weren't aware of any ways that the organization is acting outside of, or operating outside of its value. And one other thing that came up in a few responses was this experience of maybe being confined by privilege, so, and specifically racial privilege. So whether that is connected to, but just for white folks, or maybe even thinking about colorism as well, that, people might feel a little stuck or confined around how to, navigate their privilege. So we asked kind of what identities are salient for folks when they think about their participation with Mid-Atlantic, and overwhelmingly folks were like, all of them, all the identities, everything is important, but some that, really stood out in folks' responses: race, gender, age, faith practice, and socioeconomic status were most frequently named. And also, there was some note around that identity really isn't salient, and that also in that, though, people noted that that's likely just, or acknowledged that that's likely a result of the privilege, right? There's a privilege in not really considering that in participation. So people did name that. And a few named their professional identity as salient, which wasn't necessarily one of the examples given. So I thought that was important to note. Really consistent and overwhelming desire to learn more about white supremacy culture within, the organization, and then also just within practice. And there were several comments, and so a theme around specifically in the moment processing. So people really want to do more and kind of learn more about, like, what do you do in the moment? And we'll talk about that. But moving beyond awareness came up, right? So people want to know about and learn about white supremacy culture and want to talk about that. And it seemed like, at least for this pool of folks, they're really interested in moving beyond awareness, more into skills and applying, and what do you do, addressing fragility, thinking about conflict resolution, and then again, more specific application to group therapy skills. And again, there's a strong interest just in terms of topics, and I'll provide just a list of the specific topics that were named, because I think that that'll be helpful to you all to think about. But sexual orientation, sexuality, gender, neurodiversity, and ability were topics that folks were interested in learning more about. And then, like I said, there are more specific ideas that I'll share at the end. There was a note and a thing that came up around suggestions for increasing outreach and collaboration within university mental health departments, and then also other, kind of discipline or credential specific professional associations. Cost, figuring out a way to lower costs for events, and then again, those specific recommendations I'll share out. And then there was a suggestion that came up that kind of presented itself as a theme around partnering with religious organizations, and so that might be something for folks to consider. And then there was an opportunity for folks to just kind of elaborate or share general kind of additional feedback. And so one thing that I'll just kind of name is that something that came up is just appreciation for the efforts that have been made so far, and a whole lot of encouragement to do more and kind of continue. There was a suggestion around bringing together the white and BIPOC affinity groups, and some people gave more context for why they haven't attended, and it was pretty specific, so I didn't want to kind of share that, but people did want to just kind of share more about why they haven't attended, which I think is notable to say. And then a big theme, and again, you saw it in the other suggestions as well, is just more applied discussion related to addressing racism in group practice, and again, as opposed to that awareness building only. And then these were just more specifics on each item. Okay, and so I guess you probably might have had questions at any point, but I'm going to move into talking about my recommendations and considerations, and this might be maybe a good place to pause and see if anyone had any questions about any of the data or anything that I shared in terms of the results or what I've highlighted within the results. So I'll pause that and kind of just check in.
Yeah, I had a check-in about more of just like, the clinical relevance piece and then the accessibility, that part of the survey.
Mm-hmm.
And do you think it'd be like something worth like, exploring in terms of just like asking, I know this is actually, let me wait because this might be a part of the recommendations.
Well,
But,
still go ahead and ask your question, Maggie. That way I can kind of make sure I respond to it.
Okay, yeah. So just thinking about, whether it would be worthwhile, like really exploring a different format of reaching out to members, asking about what did they find clinically relevant and where they'd want to see things go
Right.
in terms of clinical relevance and accessibility and things like that. So narrowing it down a little bit more.
Yeah, and I think I will share, I think there is some context in some of the recommendations, but also I do think that there is opportunity for more dialogue, right? So some listening sessions, and maybe there's a way, as you all are, you know, doing registration for different events, maybe that is kind of like a good prompt to kind of include around what kinds of topics, what is most clinically relevant for you, who do you see, what are you, you know, what do you see most in your population? So that could be something to just ask more regularly in evaluation and that sort of thing, because we didn't ask very specifically. But that's a good question, right? What's clinically relevant for one of us may not be clinically relevant, right? So that feels pretty specific, but that's a good question. And then
Dr.
Thank
Burdine,
you.
thank you so much for this work, and just really appreciate you being willing to have this conversation with us. Quick question I had around the feedback about more content around sexuality and gender in our programming. I was wondering if there was any, like, just further responses about that, what specifically people might be looking for, because that seems like a really important piece of feedback for us.
Josh, can you say that again? Pardon me.
Oh, sure. No problem. Yeah, my question was just, it seems really important, the piece of feedback about more programming centering on gender and sexuality. And I was curious, beyond just those two topics generally, if there was anything more specific about that people might be looking for in terms of
Yeah.
topics or future presentations.
Yeah. Okay. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna skip ahead to that topic slide, because I think that that might be connected to both of you all's questions. And I think that there were some really interesting topics that were there, and, you know, in terms of what people wanted to see. So let me resume. Oh, okay. Is that is the recommendations and consideration slide up for everyone? Okay. So pardon me while I skip through. So forgive me for. Okay, so these were some of the suggestions, both for just topics and future direction that folks had. And so in terms of specific topics that came up, and again, all of the things that I named were there, and then these were very specific topics that people named in addition to that. So ageism and aging, size, exploring queerness, chronic illness, and the link between chronic illness and then like kind of gender and socioeconomic status, and well, I want to pause. I want to say more about that, but I also want to be, you know, kind of protective of what folks shared. But I think in general, intersectionality came up. And so thinking about, you know, race and, you know, religion, or race and other things. Exploring diversity within groups. And so kind of acknowledging that, you know, not all Black folks have the same experience, right? You have folks who, you know, maybe are come to the U.S. or come to Mid-Atlantic from other, you know, parts of the world, for example, right? And those racialized experiences might be different. So some conversation around that seems like it would be helpful. People wanted to learn and just kind of acknowledge that terminology seems to change often. And so folks wanted to just kind of, you know, any terminology focus as programming seems like it would be helpful. And then as we've named, specifically addressing white supremacy culture and racism in real time as a group therapy practice. And then inclusive, maybe more cross-cultural approaches around addressing racism, exploring unconscious bias, and then there's a whole chunk that kind of dealt with kind of managing what happens, like how do we address harm, right? And so defensiveness, how do we acknowledge harm from a place of privilege, specific examples of how white supremacy culture shows up, or racism shows up in groups. and then how to notice more, kind of subtle behaviors that or actions that might be connected to white supremacy culture. White supremacy culture, racism, and supervision, understanding transformative justice, learning more about and just kind of naming more about the history of racism and white supremacy within our discipline, our collective discipline of psychology, and then how to really, kind of diversify group practice and group theory, right? How to decolonize our work as group clinicians, and then kind of more set, clear goals. And then there was a specific suggestion around like having a year-long kind of schedule of like kind of monthly topics so that people can kind of know what's ahead for an entire year, for example. Okay, I'll kind of go back to my recommendations. I wonder before I do that if there are any other questions that people have. Okay, so yeah, we'll just share and kind of I think, yes, I put these in the categories of the different sections. So that first section connected to demographics and Mid-Atlantic affiliation with Mid-Atlantic. It seems like that certainly, more effort toward outreach and engagement with membership around their professional disciplines might be really helpful, and or ensuring that with when you have a presentation and when you have speakers, that they are aware and kind of naming the diversity around professional identity. It looks like someone. Okay. I'll come back to that question for them. And also, because I named toward the beginning that a good majority of the folks who responded to this, and I think that you can kind of assume that that is reflective of folks, the people who participated are reflective of the people who generally participate in, activities, but a large majority, I think it was 95%, are licensed. And so definitely offering continuing education for programming seems like it could be really helpful. And there is still a good chunk of folks, though, who are pre-licensed, right, or students. So thinking about a way to give incentives for attendance, especially if we're wanting to increase, early career or student participation from pre-licensed folks. Yeah, so I think one of the things that was notable, right, is, kind of just thinking about engaging in more dialogue and maybe listening sessions around longevity within the organization and kind of getting underneath, like what is promoting or encouraging folks, what's motivating folks to participate, so long within Mid-Atlantic, and kind of getting more information there, and trying to figure out how to replicate that or replicate the experiences or provide something similar to folks. And so if it is, for example, if a lot of that longevity is about relationship building and reuniting with folks, then what are ways that we can increase the community and the sense of community and engagement for the newer members, right? So maybe there's some specific programming for newer folks to kind of come together so that they can build that sense of connection that will promote the longevity within the organization. Since it seems like, there is, folks talked about wanting to really apply and get more applied information, and then also wanting to lost the second part of that thought, but more information and kind of marketing in programming that emphasizes the fact that emphasizes clinical application, or that emphasizes how much people are really benefiting from these things. And so using some of the data to really just increase marketing for events, and people really are benefiting from your programming and they're feeling better about their skills. And so marketing that would be really helpful. And then, like I said, opportunities for networking during programming and events is probably going to be beneficial. And you might also be very clear about how programming is connected to and kind of tailored around the membership experiences. So thinking specifically about how we market events would be helpful. And continuing to have, opportunities for minimizing costs and lowering expenses. And, we, with the, anti-racism committee, we talked quite a bit about like, how can we do this? And I think that having some conversation and some maybe a task force that kind of looks at this specifically might be, really helpful. But some of the, just ideas that I have, of course, increasing scholarships. I know that you all provide, scholarships, but also maybe thinking about, and this might be connected to, let me see. Yeah, this is, there wasn't necessarily any strong indication of a need to shift the current structure and timing of meetings and conferences, but there also wasn't a whole lot of, it didn't seem like people were really committed to, right? That didn't seem like the current structure and meeting and offerings were, kind of impacting people's attendance. So you could really experiment with new formatting. And if conferences, having day-long conferences or weekend conferences is a huge expense, maybe it does look like maybe instead of having day-long, you have like a series, right, that's hour-long that is over Zoom. And so it cuts the cost to the organization and thereby cuts the cost for participation. But it does look like there is opportunity to kind of experiment a little bit with formatting. In general, it sounded like someone unmuted. I don't know if folks had a question. Okay. Yeah, so since people are paying attention to the listserv, and that is pretty active, there might be some room and opportunity for more kind of campaigns looking at marketing. So, whether it's videos or opportunities for people to learn more about the organization, that sort of thing, trying to embed those into the communication that goes out might be really helpful, since you do have a little bit of a targeted audience there. And I do recommend kind of looking at opportunities for more cross-cultural learning opportunities. And so there is certainly benefit to having BIPOC only or identity specific processing and an effort to reduce harm, right, and increase learning. And there's also some rich value around coming together. And I think based on the feedback, that coming together needs to be coupled with resources for how to address harm, right? How do we manage conflict? How do we do this work in the moment? And so as there is hope and, kind of need that's been identified around coming together, particularly with the affinity groups, talking about then how are we going to navigate and harm that might come up, or how do we, do more processing in the moment? And again, like I've mentioned, I think continued programming connected to addressing white supremacy culture, and finding ways to increase racial equity and justice seem like they're likely to be well received. Right. In terms of direction, it seems like the current direction, or current at the time, was really well supported, and so I think continuing in the direction that Mid-Atlantic has been going is going to be really helpful, and you might consider highlighting more of the efforts, and so that you can ensure that new members or people who might be interested are aware of the programming, and then also, not just the programming, but the quality and success of the programming. And so, not just kind of boasting like, oh, woohoo, here's our organization, we're doing all of this amazing work, but really communicating gratitude and just increase awareness around these shared values and shared commitment around elimination of white supremacy culture. And so just kind of giving credit mostly where credit is due, because all of these things, if there's been success, if things have been well received, it's been the entire community that's been a part of that, and it's been the community that has kind of co-created some of these. And so really reflecting gratitude as you are marketing. Yeah, maybe there might be some benefit to sharing out more, kind of testimonials, or sharing out the ways that specific or individual members are benefiting. And it might be targeting specifically newer members, or people who are maybe more early career professionals, getting them to share more. And so that folks can, maybe those newer members might see themselves a little bit more in the makeup of Mid-Atlantic. And in terms of, bylaws and structure of Mid-Atlantic, it doesn't seem like membership may not have enough insight into the organization culture, history, and structure. So just providing more transparency, and we've talked about that. I think there have been some really meaningful and important updates to website, right? But just increasing transparency, giving people more information about the organization. A perfect example of that is today, Liz, you took an opportunity to just introduce yourself, right? And kind of name and talk about some of the folks who are on the board and what they're doing. So opportunity for that might be helpful. And just in general, thinking about how you are orienting people to the organization. So maybe even setting something in place that is more formal kind of orientation to the organization. So not just, hey, here's how you, kind of become a member, but once you do become a member, here's some things that you should know, right? So really help people to better understand who Mid-Atlantic is and what they're participating in. And again, infographics, pamphlets, directing folks to the website for different things could be really helpful in that. And I always love a meet and greet, and just like opportunities for people to humanize the leadership of the organization. So those are things that you could set. That's time that you could set aside in conferences, or just meetings. If some of the leadership team and the board can stay after, just inviting folks to come and be in community with you. And since we didn't get I think, at least from my perspective, there wasn't a whole lot of information in here, because a lot of the folks who completed the survey didn't have a lot of context. It might be really helpful to kind of have some focused conversation or some listening sessions and inviting people to give more information about the structure and bylaws. Okay. Bear with us, bear with me, almost done. It seems like, you know, membership really does trust leadership and, you know, people who you all invite as speakers and facilitators. So that's promising to me. And so, you know, making sure that as folks are onboarded into leadership positions, just making sure that they have an opportunity to learn from the successes of previous leadership is something that's helpful. And I'm sure that I think that there's ways, especially with the presidency, that's folded in, because you serve on term and then you have, you know, kind of people who are doing that jointly. So there's some overlap, and you might just consider institutionalizing that for other positions, right? So just making sure that is kind of set and maybe placed in bylaws. And then in general, since the leadership is, you know, relatively successful, maybe some more opportunity for leadership development, you know, for membership, right? And a way to kind of like recruit new leadership. And so thinking specifically about creating opportunities for people to learn more about leadership roles, and as a way to kind of spark their interest as you have members, you know, who might transition, or leadership who might transition off the board, for example. And then I think it also would be really helpful as you are thinking about programming, to also make sure that you are providing, you know, people who you might have come in who aren't going to have as much access to this kind of information, giving them that, right? So letting speakers and facilitators know, like, hey, here are some of the needs and here's some of the expectations, and here's what people have benefited from already, so that they can kind of continue and just help ensure that that success is sustained. And so it might look like, as you are, you know, recruiting speakers and that sort of thing, you might kind of just share that list, that here's a list of topics that people are really interested in. If you can fold that into what you share, that would be really helpful, making sure that people are thinking about clinical application and relevance. Those sorts of things would be helpful. Is someone sharing? Okay. Okay. Again, that emphasis on inclusion and belonging in marketing, I would strongly recommend that. And it seems like, you know, membership understands that difficult and courageous conversation is necessary. And so maybe increasing, you know, guidelines and procedures for how the organization itself, but individual members will name and address the, you know, any injustice or harm that happens. And just making sure that, you know, equity values are embedded into the organizational structure, and bylaws seems to be supported. Since a good majority of, you know, the participants here identified as white and identified as women, right, we might look at kind of further exploring how experiences of difficult dialogue or conversation is how, you know, BIPOC members and gender minority members or sexual orientation minority members are experiencing that. So maybe some more listening sessions or focused discussions to get more perspective there might be helpful. Yeah, so it seems like, self-disclosure was really important, particularly connected to the privileged identity. And so we might consider ways to help support folks and create opportunities for self-reflection and professional development around folks' more marginalized experiences. And I think that that is certainly connected to naming harm maybe in the moment. And so some more, I think that there is potentially a need for some more guidance around how individual members or facilitators, leaders are addressing harm within the organization. So some specific learning opportunities connected to how to facilitate discussion might be really helpful. And I think that that would also be connected and could be linked to specific group intervention, group therapy intervention. Okay, and then in terms of self and other assessments, identity development and relevance of identity for members who identify as white may be warranted and could be helpful. So specific opportunities. I know that there is the white affinity group, but maybe even creating more broad programming and events that are connected to, in this case, since we're focused mostly around race with this assessment, but all matters and forms of privileged identity. I think we all could use more kind of nurturing and development and exploration around our privileged identities. And so thinking specifically about topics that are connected to privilege and navigating privilege. Again, that strengthening clinical applicability and intervention programming specific to that, I would recommend. And then maybe doing a deeper dive into better understanding that member to member perception of skills in conjunction with confidence, because it seems like folks were relatively confident in their abilities, kind of navigating that. But then there was also this big theme around like, how do we address things? So that to me is kind of like, okay, there is some confidence there, but then people aren't sure necessarily about how to address. So just some, further exploration of that might be helpful. And I don't think that there should be assumption around, that people's participation or lack of participation is kind of indicative of general interest. So diversifying programming and expanding programming connected to racial justice, I think would be helpful. But kind of diversifying how you're talking and thinking about racial justice and expanding upon that would be helpful. And then connected to just general feedback. So it seems like, folks agreed that there's a whole lot of intention and, some framework around intent versus impact might be really helpful, right? So people can assume that there's good intention, but that doesn't necessarily always translate to behavior, or that people feel good about that. I think that impact can be different, right? So exploring term limits, outreach practices, how we name and address harm, and accessibility seems to be warranted. And looking specifically at religion and spirituality as it relates to clinical practice might be meaningful, and just in general, taking an intersectional approach to addressing racism seems supported. Okay. So that is, you know, in terms of the information and just kind of what came out, and then the suggestions that I have, that's what I have. And so those are those 2 links. I also put them in the chat to the full report, and a PDF to this PowerPoint is there. And it should be, you know, relatively similar information, just different formats. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. Just open us up. I think we have a good chunk of time. I wonder, you know, I was really curious, and I see Gina, thanks for your hand. I see that. I'll get to you in just a second. I asked at the outset, or I invited folks at the outset to maybe, especially when you looked at that data, right, without my interpretation and without my recommendations, I am really curious if anything came up for folks in terms of suggestion. You have your president, future president, and several members of the board here. And so if there are specific, you know, questions or considerations or recommendations that you have, this is certainly the time to share those. So I'll hear from Gina, and then we'll kind of walk us through the different sections of this to just hear from folks and get feedback. Gina?
Thanks so much. My feedback is not substantive in terms of any particular area, but I just wanted to say, and especially since I have to leave a little early, which I regret, this is the first time in a while that I've heard any good news. And I know that you're not trying to hand us a little package with a neat bow on it, you know, that there's a lot of work still to be done. But, you know, a part of my family right now has COVID. And I, like many people, have been spending probably way too much time watching horrific things on social media. So I just wanted to thank you and acknowledge how gratifying it feels, both personally and professionally, to hear some feedback that says, you know, you guys are doing a pretty good job. Keep it up. So thank you for that.
Yeah, and I'm glad that, you know, stands out, because I think with all of the horror and trauma that we face, and all the limitations around resources and all of those things, it can get pretty overwhelming pretty quick, and pretty you know, disheartening and discouraging. And so I'm glad that it stands out to you, and it certainly did stand out to me, that in terms of direction and intention and interest and engagement, I think, you know, you certainly are in a really good position, right? And it doesn't mean that you know, the work is easy, or that there won't be challenges, or, you know, kind of struggle within it. But yeah, it's good news that folks are engaged and inspired and motivated. And it was really interesting. I think one of the questions that the board had was like, okay, this seems really, you know, kind of positive, and like people are, you know, kind of interested, and maybe there is some disconnect between, and I don't know, I'm kind of posing it to you, maybe there is some disconnect between, you know, when people sit down and reflect really pointedly on what the organization is doing, that, you know, it's like, oh, we're doing some good things and some things are good, versus maybe right after a really, you know, kind of an event where maybe there's some microaggressive comments, or, you know, and then people are kind of lasered into kind of an individual experience. And so there could be a lot of that happening. And again, I don't know that, but it's some things to kind of keep in mind, that this kind of surveying and assessment is really a broad look, versus, you know, any given day or any given event or any given meeting, people might feel really differently. And oftentimes, or sometimes, the loudest voices aren't necessarily, right, reflective of the majority, right? And so we certainly see that in all over the place right now in particular. Liz?
Yeah, I want to echo again my gratitude to you. This was so helpful. And what I didn't acknowledge is that myself and some of the rest of us on the board are hearing this from, we've seen the written report, but this is the first time we're hearing from you the sort of digestion of the information and your recommendations. And I'm already just buzzing with a lot of good ideas. I just wanted to acknowledge, just in terms of this small group that we are at present, that within this group, there are some of you that are very, very familiar with Mid-Atlantic. You've been with us forever and ever. And there are some of you that I'm not even sure are members, or that are very new to what we're up to. And so I just kind of wanted to say there are no stupid questions. One of the things that I heard loud and clear from you is that we need to be more transparent about our history and sort of what's going on in the organization. And I think that this is a potential opportunity to get into some of that. So I just kind of wanted to open up that invitation and acknowledge that different people are coming in from different vantage points.
Yeah, thank you for that, and just kind of naming too the power that comes from that, right? And so as you're inviting folks to kind of share out, it can be harder, you know, or more vulnerable to share out when you don't have that context. But we really do want to invite whatever questions and reflections, and maybe a way to do that is to kind of float through and kind of circle back, right? So when you saw the data and the information, or maybe some of the highlights that I shared, was there anything that came up as like, did anything make folks curious, or did you have any different kind of interpretation of some of the results than maybe I had?
Kim, could I also put out there, Sally had put in a question a little while ago, just did you find notable differences in the responses between white and BIPOC members, and on what topics? So I think that's a great question.
Yes, it is. Thank you for that reminder. And did Sally have to leave? So maybe, but we have the recording, so maybe they can come back to it. We talked a little bit about that, I think, in the conversation that we had with the anti-racism committee, kind of taking an initial look at some of the data. And because there were so few participants, or there was, I guess, lower percentages, I wanted to be careful to not do too much kind of specific looking and exploring in those kinds of ways around, like, oh, where are there differences, or what are, you know, kind of Black folks saying in particular, because it may identify folks. And so I didn't look too much at that, but I think that it's safe to assume that there probably are some differences, right, in perception. I don't know if, and Jill, you said that this felt like a good question. I wish Sally were here to talk more about maybe what you assume some of the differences might be, and what topics there might be. I do think that for me, I wonder, you know, impressions around confidence in addressing things might be, I can assume that there might be some differences there. But I'm curious if other folks, kind of wonder or have hunches about where there might be differences.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the things comes up with that high level of response rate from white women, that it really makes me think about, I guess I have a couple things, makes me wonder about some of the positiveness, which is great, but also is there a little bit, is it reality based, would be one of my questions. And then the other question that I was thinking of, which of course now has just totally spaced, I may have to come in later to get it. Yeah, it's not going to come right now. So I'll leave you with one.
Yeah, and feel free to, kind of jump back in whenever it comes back to you. But yeah, right. So thinking specifically about, who completed this survey, and one of the questions that the board and Art posed to me to kind of respond to or ask or offer perspective around is, is the demographic of the respondents here, the participants here, reflective of the demographic of the organization itself. And I certainly don't know that, and there's certainly a way to kind of get that information as people come in, and maybe there's a way, like at conferences and different things like that, to begin to ask folks how they identify, so folks wouldn't have to assume. But I wonder if it might be fair to assume that regardless of whether or not it's fully representative of Mid-Atlantic as a whole, I think it certainly is, representative of who is engaging and in what direction, right? I think that maybe it's fair to say that in terms of participation and events and, membership engagement and leadership and all of that, that probably is who that is reflective, right? That range and what we're seeing in here is reflective of kind of that core, which happens in every group and every organization, right? You have a core kind of membership, or people who you can count on to kind of be active and engaged.
Okay, thanks. The other thing actually was, and I don't know, because of COVID, some numbers at when the transition happened and we started offering different conferences on this topic, the numbers of attendance seemed to go down a bit, and it could simply be because it was COVID, but I just think that was an interesting thing that we saw a bit.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm happy to hear other people's, kind of reaction to that. I oftentimes just refer to my own life and own life experiences. The past 3 or 4 years, my community has kind of gotten real small. Like the things that I engage in, there has been a real shift for me professionally and personally in terms of like how I'm managing time, and just the realities of this exploitative engagement, capitalist kind of engagement and work culture, and people really trying to, decolonize from it. And I think sometimes meetings and conferences and that sort of thing are what's accessible to people to cut back on. That certainly has been my experience. I can't say that that's what, other folks' experiences are, but I'm imagining that that's kind of linked for sure.
Yeah, Kim, linked to what Jill was just asking about, I mean, I'm curious about if you saw anything in the data that suggests a kind of negative response to some of the mission shift that has happened in the last 5 to 7 years in the organization. Because I mean, it's interesting that we've had such a shift in the same time that COVID has happened, right? And I'm wondering if, I'm particularly thinking about the data point about members feeling like there's a gap between their interest level in our topics versus the topics that we're presenting, right? I'm wondering if that's like one place to look for maybe some, I don't want to use the word backlash, but that's the word that's coming to mind.
Sure. I think that there was a theme in the more narrative, because I don't think we asked anything specific in the, the more qualitative or quantitative items. But in the narrative section, there was a little bit of a theme, or at least a few people. And I think in that, if you take kind of the survey and how people answer surveys and respond to surveys, if someone took the time in that narrative to put in feedback, I take it as really important to them or kind of meaningful. And so one thing that that was voiced a couple of times is this feeling that the focus around race and race equity has been kind of narrow. And that's, I'm saying that maybe a little bit more positively, right? But that I do think that there's a sense that, folks are like, okay, but what about me in that? Where do I see me in that? Yes, these issues are important. And also, there are other things, or, my lens in terms of race and ethnicity is wider. And so I do think that typical kind of, which Janet Helms in some ways talks about as whataboutism, that I put in that I referenced as well, that can come up as like, but what about this, and this? And that's fair, and certainly I think comes from a place of good intention. And also, I believe when we do race equity well, you are also looking at, disability justice. You're also looking at all of these things. And so I do think that there was a little element of that came to mind when you asked that question, Josh, that I do think, and that's, kind of connected to that emphasis on let's expand how we're talking about race. Let's look at more intersectional approaches. And that's where that comes from.
Thanks so much for that.
Mm-hmm. Anything else that stood out to folks in terms of just looking at the data, and anything that you would, kind of suggest or that stood out to you that I didn't name? And I see Jessica, you're unmuted.
Yeah. Hi. Sorry, I can't turn my video on.
No.
Thank you. I was wondering about the question about people needing their racial identities to be recognized or not recognized at conferences, and how important that was to them. Seemed like it was 60-40 roughly, and I guess I'm not sure how to interpret that, and what the marching orders would be for that kind of dichotomy. So I'm wondering if you had any more thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. It certainly, stood out to me, and some ways to maybe think about that, or some things to consider is, one, I think it takes, it's a more advanced is probably the wrong language, but a more advanced maybe skill or level of awareness to recognize me being affirmed is important. I think that so maybe people don't understand that, identity affirmation, one might not even understand identity affirmation and why that's important, and how that links and connects to mental health and wellness and all of those things. Right. So that's a piece of it, or something that I would imagine, or I would be curious about. And then also just thinking about, the ways that different racialized experiences, produce that, and certain groups are racialized and others aren't. So BIPOC folks are racialized in such a way that, that racial identity is at the forefront because they have been racialized, they have been marginalized. And so it kind of is maybe a little bit more front and center in the general socialization. Whereas, you know, for white folks or for whatever privileged, you know, kind of identity, that may not be as much of your awareness because you are not racialized as much, right? From the majority or from the folks who are in power. And so I think looking a little bit more at identity development would give you more insight in terms of like, how are people thinking about their identity? And I think that that is linked to affirmation around identity. And, but I think, yeah, that's certainly an area to kind of look at, like, what does it mean? And I think when we asked the question, I think there was an intention of making sure that having identity be a focus and having looking at identity, I think there was an attempt to maybe make sure that that is important and relevant and a need. And so I think that that's a part of why we asked the question. And I don't know, we're going back a whole lot of ways in terms of when we were developing the items, but if anybody from the board or the anti-racism committee has more insight into that particular item, it's the item that asks, I think, you know, kind of whether or not having racial identity affirmed is important in terms of participation. And there was quite a bit of variability on them.
It's interesting for me as a white woman. I'm thinking that, again, we're looking at the high level of respondents being white women, and potentially that is not a major, it's not the first thing that you're thinking about, is identity and having that being supported, because it just, that's kind of accepted. And so, and that's one of the things that strikes me.
Yeah. Oh, and I forgot another thought, like kind of connected to that. Also, I think it reasonably, it might be hard to say, yes, it's important as a white woman to have my identity affirmed, right? There might be some, you know, kind of hesitation around, like, there's a different meaning to have your white identity affirmed than to have Black identity affirmed, right? And so that people may have, you know, kind of hesitated to respond one way or the other, or maybe responding that it's not important was more was an attempt to kind of, you know, kind of less engage around white supremacy culture, or like people saying, no, let's minimize my identity, let's focus on, you know, other folks too. So
another
Thank you.
recommendation. Oh, sorry. Jessica.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you. That's very helpful. Thank you.
yeah, you bet.
Mm-hmm.
Another one of your recommendations, Kim, was around how to sort of survey BIPOC and sexual minority members about the impact of learning on them. And I wondered if we could get your suggestions about how to do that, because maybe it's not an additional survey. Maybe it's like more of like a listening session model or some other way to engage BIPOC or LGBTQ members to hear about their experiences. I just wondered if you had any thoughts about that.
Yes. Way back when we initially kind of decided, or, you know, when the board decided that a needs assessment was kind of the direction to go, there was also, in addition to this survey, I recommended like listening sessions as well. And so just in terms of resources for the board, this was prioritized, but I definitely think that a large part of what's needed at this point, and what would have been nice to have kind of coupled with this kind of data, is also, you know, the listening sessions, and to give folks opportunity to really just engage in different ways, right? Because some people, they don't want to do another survey. And like I mentioned, I think in the creation of it, like some people, you know, I invited people to resist, right? Like I'm not filling out a survey, I'm not doing that, but people might, you know, have a little bit more interest in hearing, you know, giving maybe more literal voice to their experiences. So I definitely think there's opportunity to listen more and to hear more.
Well, I could add, I would love to see or even have an opportunity to participate in whether it's called a listening session or a process group, opportunities for people to discuss
Yeah.
what goes on inside of them when these issues are talked about. Because my sense is that it really varies. And as I say that, I'm real aware that unless there's somebody Black whose face is not shown, I might be certainly probably the only Black man here. I don't think I'm not the only Black person here. And I think that, well, that occurred to me. It may have occurred to other people as well. What it means remains to be seen. But I've been around Mid-Atlantic for a long time, as some people know.
Yeah. Yeah, and thank you for just voicing that you'd be interested in that, because I think it's helpful for folks to kind of hear, because certainly, you know, I think that the affinity groups and those spaces are intended, and I think that that is a way to kind of listen and hear, but there's a different specific to this, wanting to listen and hear more about people's experiences when discussing and when addressing white supremacy culture. I think that, you know, that's a different kind of grouping, and that's a different kind of discussion and facilitation even altogether. So just thanks for naming that, and also thank you for naming just, you know, the racial makeup of this room, right, and kind of the impact that it, or alluding to the impact that it has on you. Liz?
Yeah, I was still sort of noodling Jessica's comment, and I mean, thank you, Reggie, also for naming, you know, being maybe perhaps the sole Black man in the room, because I think that is like in real time, sort of that question in real life, right? Like, what does it mean to have our identity acknowledged and affirmed? And I just was thinking sort of more broadly about like the sort of the mental journey that we've been on at Mid-Atlantic. And I don't think this is unique to us. I think that culturally we're like on this journey, and it has something to do sort of with like color blindness and those sort of ideas that we have this amazing offering, which is Mid-Atlantic, and we've been doing these conferences for decades and decades. And we have this like great format that we do, and this is how we've always done it, and isn't it great, and like come and be part of what we've got, and we want you to sort of like come in line and be part of this thing. And I think what we're learning is that in of itself comes from a white supremacy culture perspective, and that there's many different ways to I was going to say skin the cat, which is such a weird saying, but there's so many ways to skin the cat, and there's so many different ways to approach what we're doing, how we do group, what our the way that we move people into leadership positions, the way that we think about how we communicate to one another. I mean, there's just so much variety. And I think that comes down to identity and how, like, what works for each of us individually, and talking about that and creating space for different voices to think through like how we're doing this thing, right? Instead of sort of defaulting to a white-centered perspective or a historical perspective, or how we've always done it, really thinking more broadly about like who's actually in the room and who are we actually communicating to. So I just thought that Jessica's question sort of, I don't know, was on that somehow.
Yeah. And I mean, I think at the kind of at the foundation of all of this discussion of equity really comes down to, are you really celebrating and inviting diversity, right? Like that is that's the goal. And I think some of that can kind of get missed and kind of lost, because we've it's been I don't know, especially for the field, maybe the last 40 years, we've kind of gone from, okay, diversity, make sure there's people in the room. Well, it's not really diversity if you have people in the room, but you're still doing the same things, right? Diversity, true diversity and true celebration of diversity invites, folks to the table, so to speak. People can see themselves reflected in policy and procedure. And where we kind of have progressed into looking at things like justice and right. If we really, what would we have to do to make some of that diversity happen? It might look like some, justice oriented. Hey, if you've been in that organization for X amount of years, you can't participate in, this pool of kind of call for this particular position or whatever, right? Or this particular position is for people who have not ever served, right? Or who are new to the organization. You have to do things like that might at surface look unfair, but it's actually justice oriented, right? Because it's looking at kind of undoing everything. And I think that that's what makes this work really hard, right? Because justice and equity, it changes things quite a bit. We have about 4 minutes, and I'm remembering, Liz, that you said that you wanted to take a chunk of time. Anyways, I'll just say thank you for the engagement. Thank you for being here. This is, it's not lost on me that this is a couple of hours that folks could have been doing other things, and to come and be in community and bear witness to all the reflection that people poured into this assessment, I think is really important. And so thank you all for being here, and certainly do wish you all well, and want to be a part of whatever, you all do moving forward. But thank you for this. And Liz or Jill or
Yeah, I just wanted to let people know some ways to be involved. I think it's more important to be more specific, and so I just wanted to make sure that it was acknowledged. We do have an ongoing white affinity group and a BIPOC consultation group. The BIPOC consultation group will meet next on January 21st. And if you're on our listserv, you should be getting those. You do have to be a member to join those groups, but our membership is really accessible. It's easy to join. Please go on our website. You'll be added to our listserv. You should see those notifications. So January 21st is the BIPOC consultation group, and that's led by Maggie, who's here, and Chris Ray, who's not here. And then on January 28th is the white affinity group, and that is led by Jill and Barbara, who are both here currently. And I also wanted to just, so much of some of the suggestions you said were about outreach, Kim. And we are very serious about this, and we really need your help. We really, please, if you are connected as an alumni to your training program, a counseling center that you interned at or used to work for, a community agency that you might have a connection with, please, please, please make that connect. Help us connect to those people, because it makes such a difference for us to actually have a known connection. Rather, we are doing the blast emails out to people, saying, hey, this is an offering, please join. But it really makes such a difference when we have an actual connection. So any connection that you can think of, that would be so great. Also, I just want to say that we're not going to have a spring conference this year because Mid-Atlantic is hosting the AGPA conference that is local this year. It is in Maryland at the National Harbor, the last week of February into March. That's agpa.org if you're interested in joining us for that conference. And then we will have our normally scheduled fall conference, but we don't have dates for that yet. There will be a spring happy hour. Look on the listserv for that information. There will probably be more roundtables in the upcoming year. We're talking about doing some of these other formats, one day or one afternoon trainings. So please keep us in your minds, and we would love to stay connected to you. Thank you so much, Kim, for your time and your labor on this it's gonna, I mean, it's gonna have so many legs, fruits,
Yeah,
years
yeah.
and years.
Yeah, I mean, it's you all's information and sharing and participation. I'm just reflecting it back, but thank you. I don't say that to minimize, but just to, kind of remind you all that the information came from the organization and the membership. So thank you to the membership for participating in the way that you did.
I'm just going to echo that, Kim. I mean, really the work you have done, and I hear what you're saying, it's all of us. But without your guidance on this, we wouldn't be sitting here with this information and the richness of it. So thank you for guiding us here.
Yes, absolutely. Okay.
Hi, Karen.
Try to be as well as possible in the context and enjoy your Sunday, y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you
Yeah.
all so much.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Liz.